The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. In April of 1993, inside one of Ohio's most dangerous prisons, a routine confrontation spiraled into one of the deadliest uprisings in U.S. history. For 11 days, inmates controlled an entire cell block, took guards hostage, and forced the nation to confront years of neglect that authorities tried to bury. This wasn't a riot born overnight. It was the breaking point of a system falling apart, racial tension boiling, overcrowding reaching extremes, and a single argument unlocking a chain of violence no one was prepared to stop. This is what really happened behind the locked gates of Lucasville, and why the truth almost never came out. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. From the outside, the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility looked like any other maximum security prison in the early 1990s. Cold concrete walls, razor wire stacked like metal thorns, and guard towers watching every inch of the yard. But inside, tension had been growing for years. Lucasville wasn't just overcrowded. It was overloaded with unresolved conflict, neglected warnings, and a population made up of some of the state's most volatile inmates. Fights were common, stabbings were routine, and communication between staff and prisoners barely existed. The daily routine was rigid, but beneath that structure lived a quiet resentment. Food quality had dropped, medical care was poor, and multiple racial groups were competing for influence. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Muslims, and several smaller prison gangs. Most days, different groups avoided each other because they understood the balance that kept the prison functioning, but the balance was fragile. One wrong move could shift everything. In the months before the riot, Lucasville began enforcing new policies that inmates saw as hostile. The most controversial was a tuberculosis testing procedure involving a chemical injection, something the Muslim inmates said violated their religious beliefs. Instead of addressing the concern, officials pushed the policy without transparency. Rumors spread that the test was harmful, that it was mandatory, and that refusal meant punishment or segregation. Even prisoners who weren't Muslim felt the fear. Tension rose in the recreation yard, where inmates held quiet conversations away from prying eyes. Some claimed the administration was provoking the Muslim population on purpose. Others believed the policy was simply reckless. But all agreed on one thing: the prison wasn't listening. By early April, inmates began warning staff that something serious was coming. Guards dismissed the threats as empty talk. They'd heard it all before: claims of uprisings, walkouts, and organized protests that never materialized. But this time, the warnings weren't just noise. They were signals that the population had reached its boiling point. For weeks, the administration ignored the growing frustration. Segregation units were full, staff shortages worsened, and communication from leadership remained unclear. Tension was thick in every hallway. Even guards sensed a shift. Some noticed inmates grouping in unusual ways, avoiding specific areas, or leaving rec yard early. Others reported increased hostility during routine searches. Still, no action was taken. Then came April 11th, Easter Sunday. The prison was already operating on limited staff. The atmosphere was similar to any holiday, quieter than usual, but uneasy. Most inmates were in the recreation yard when word spread that the TB tests were about to become mandatory, beginning the next morning. For many, that was the final trigger. A group of inmates, some Muslim, some not, huddled near the far end of the yard where cameras couldn't fully reach. Their conversation was brief, but decisive. They agreed that the administration wasn't going to change the policy unless the population made a move strong enough to force negotiations. They didn't plan for bloodshed. They didn't plan for hostage-taking. They didn't plan for 11 days of chaos. They planned to disrupt the routine, overwhelm the unit, and demand a meeting. But plans in prison rarely stay controlled. At 3 p.m., as inmates returned from recreation, a small fight broke out near the entrance of L Block. It wasn't staged. It erupted naturally between two inmates arguing about the TB test. A guard rushed in to break it up. That reaction became the spark. In the chaos of the scuffle, several inmates pushed their way through the doors as they opened, overpowering the officer and securing his keys. Within seconds, dozens followed. Word spread fast. "We got the block." The moment the keys changed hands, every inmate understood that the line had been crossed. There was no going back. Guards inside the block were quickly overwhelmed. Some were forced into cells. Others were tied up or beaten. In less than 10 minutes, an entire housing unit was under inmate control. No one expected it to happen that quickly. Not the guards, not the administration, not even the prisoners themselves. Panic spread through the facility. Alarms rang, radios crackled, and officers scrambled to lock down surrounding units. But the inmates had already jammed some of the doors, blocked others with mattresses and metal bunks, and armed themselves with makeshift weapons, sharpened metal, broken mop handles, and pieces of torn steel. Inside L Block, leadership among the inmates formed instantly. Different gangs who normally avoided each other now held emergency meetings to decide their next move. The Muslims wanted negotiations over the TB test. The Aryan Brotherhood wanted protection and power. Others wanted the opportunity to settle long-held grudges. The administration faced a crisis they were completely unprepared to handle. They attempted to establish communication, but the prisoners shut down early efforts. They wanted control first. They wanted leverage. Hostages became that leverage. The riot was officially underway. The prison tried to contain the news, calling it a disturbance, but the truth spread beyond the walls within hours. For now, though, the outside world only knew a fraction of what was happening. Inside, the inmates controlled everything: doors, movements, and the fates of the hostages. And the atmosphere had already begun to change. What started as a protest was beginning to feel like a war zone. The pressure that had been building for years had finally exploded. And no one, not inmates, not guards, not officials, knew how far it was about to go. When L Block fell under inmate control, the first wave of panic belonged to the guards trapped inside. Some were dragged into cells, others forced against walls with makeshift blades pressed to their throats. The inmates didn't begin with a unified plan for hostages, but once they realized the advantage, the strategy shifted. Hostages became the shield, the bargaining chip, and the proof that the riot wasn't going to dissolve overnight. The prison administration attempted a fast lockdown of surrounding units, but L Block was already sealed from within. Barricades went up fast: metal bed frames, lockers, overturned tables, anything heavy enough to block the doors. Inmates welded pieces of steel to reinforce the block. Even with improvised tools, they worked quickly, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that the next move belonged to them, not the guards. The hostages were gathered into a central area known as the bubble. Some were tied at the wrists with torn clothing. Others were forced to kneel. Many were still in shock, struggling to process how fast the situation had changed. Moments earlier, they were performing routine duties. Now, they were bargaining chips in a standoff no one understood yet. The inmate leaders moved quickly. Representatives from the major prison groups, Black Muslims, Aryan Brotherhood, and smaller factions, came together in an uneasy alliance. Their relationships were built on years of distrust, but the riot forced cooperation. No single group had the manpower or influence to control the block alone. They needed unity, at least temporarily. The Muslims were focused on negotiating the TB testing procedure. Their goal was straightforward: stop the mandatory injection, start a dialogue with the administration, and avoid unnecessary killing. But the Aryan Brotherhood had different priorities. They saw the riot as a chance to gain leverage, settle scores, and possibly reshape the power structure of the prison. Meanwhile, unaffiliated inmates were simply trying to survive the chaos, unsure which side to follow. Inside the block, the hostages could hear the shouting, arguments, and frantic movement around them. Some inmates demanded executions. Others insisted that violence would destroy any chance of negotiation. Fear was thick in the air. Fear among guards who didn't know if they would make it out alive, and fear among inmates who had crossed the line into open rebellion. The administration began crisis communication attempts almost immediately. They used bullhorns, radios, and attempts through the barricaded doors to establish contact. The inmates refused at first. They moved guards deeper into the block to send a clear message. We control this space. Hours passed before any structured communication occurred. When talks did begin, they were tense and limited. The administration wanted immediate release of hostages. The inmates wanted written assurances that the TB policy would be reviewed. Neither side trusted the other. Every message passed through layers of suspicion. Inside the block, conditions deteriorated quickly. With no guards to regulate movement, hundreds of inmates roamed the unit. Some acted as enforcers for the temporary leadership. Others roamed unpredictably, adding to the volatility. Makeshift weapons were everywhere. Screams echoed through the hallways, some from injured inmates, some from those being threatened, some from guards who never expected their positions to collapse this completely. The hostages were watched constantly. Armed inmates rotated shifts, keeping blades, sharpened metal, and broken broomsticks pointed toward the guards at all times. In moments of negotiation, inmates brought a hostage to the barricaded door to speak to administration officials. Their voices were controlled but strained. They were careful not to appear too hopeful, knowing any sign of confidence might anger the inmates standing behind them. As the hours passed, the power struggle inside L Block intensified. The Muslim leadership attempted to keep order, demanding no harm come to the hostages. But the Aryan Brotherhood began targeting specific inmates they had long-standing conflicts with. Old grudges surfaced violently. Inmates considered informants were cornered and interrogated. Some were beaten, some were killed. The riot had started as a protest, but inside the barricades, it was quickly turning into something darker. The hostages heard everything. They saw inmates dragged across the block. They saw disputes between gang leaders nearly turn into internal fights. They saw the temporary alliance beginning to fracture. These divisions were dangerous. If the inmate leaders couldn't control their own people, the risk to the guards grew every hour. Meanwhile, outside the block, the administration was under pressure from state officials, the media, and the families of the hostages. At first, they tried to minimize the situation, calling it a disturbance. But helicopter footage leaked showing smoke rising from the cell block. Reporters gathered outside the prison fence. Families demanded answers, and administrators realized they were losing control of the narrative. Inside, the inmates strengthened their hold. They used the hostages to prove that negotiations couldn't be rushed. Every few hours, they moved a guard to the window to shout a message. They wanted dialogue, they wanted safety guarantees, and they wanted public acknowledgement that the TB policy was mishandled. Some hostages pleaded for calm. Others tried to remain stoic. But the fear in their voices was unmistakable. Night fell, and the block grew darker. The electricity flickered. Flashlights moved through the hallways like drifting ghosts. The smell of smoke lingered. Inmates fashioned torches from twisted fabric. The environment felt less like a prison and more like a war zone sealed behind steel doors. Tension around the hostages increased. Some younger inmates tried to assert dominance, threatening violence to appear powerful. Older inmates stepped in to prevent rash decisions. Every confrontation made the situation more unstable. Leadership inside the riot was not permanent. It was contested constantly. The hostages had no way to track time. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. Some tried to keep calm by focusing on routines, breathing patterns, mental repetition, silent prayers. Others couldn't stop shaking. One guard suffered a panic attack and had to be restrained by both inmates and other hostages to prevent him from provoking violence. Administrators outside negotiated blindly. They didn't know the conditions inside. They didn't know which inmates were in charge. They didn't know which hostages were injured. And they didn't know how quickly the situation was spiraling into a power struggle among prisoners who were never meant to work together. Inside L Block, the temporary alliance finally showed its cracks. The Aryan Brotherhood accused the Muslims of going soft. The Muslims accused the Brotherhood of undermining the original purpose of the uprising. Smaller factions saw opportunities to gain influence. Threats were exchanged. Weapons were drawn. But none of them could risk losing complete control, not while hostages were still alive and negotiations were ongoing. Amid the chaos, one fact became clear. The hostage crisis was no longer just a bargaining tool. It was now the center of a fragile, dangerous balance that could collapse at any moment. And everyone inside the block knew the next phase would be even darker. By the third day of the uprising, L Block had transformed into a fractured battleground. The inmates still control the unit, but control did not mean unity. Every hallway carried a different set of rules, depending on which group controlled it. The Muslims occupied the center of the block, keeping the hostages under strict guard. The Aryan Brotherhood held the far end near the wreck cages. Smaller independent crews spread throughout and used cells, waiting for whatever side looked stronger. The atmosphere was volatile. Every conversation felt like it could erupt into violence. What began as a unified message had dissolved. The Muslims wanted structured negotiation. The Aryan Brotherhood wanted dominance and retaliation. Independent inmates wanted safety or opportunity. Meanwhile, the administration outside had no clear understanding of these divisions. They believed they were negotiating with a single voice, but inside, the leadership was tearing itself apart. Tension peaked when a rumor spread that the administration was planning a tactical assault. Some inmates believed the prison was flooding the ventilation system with gas. Others thought the National Guard had been deployed outside. The truth was simpler. The prison was still considering its options. But rumors spread faster than facts, and fear pushed every group deeper into distrust. Inside the block, fear didn't manifest as panic. It manifested as preparation. Inmates sharpened metal, wrapped makeshift armor from torn mattresses, and patrolled the hallways with a seriousness that rivaled military units. The hostages were constantly under watch. Any attempt at escape would mean immediate retaliation, and everyone knew it. Tensions between the Muslims and Aryan Brotherhood reached a breaking point late that night. A Brotherhood member accused a Muslim leader of interfering with their plans to interrogate an inmate suspected of being an informant. The argument escalated into threats. Weapons were raised. A standoff formed in the middle of the block, with hostages lying on the floor just feet away. For a moment, the riot almost imploded from the inside. But one of the older Muslim leaders stepped forward, reminding everyone that an internal war would serve only the administration's interests. Killing each other would destroy the leverage they still had. It was a temporary bandage over a deep wound, but it worked long enough to de-escalate the confrontation. The balance held, but just barely. As negotiations resumed outside, the administration demanded proof of life. The inmates complied, bringing 2 guards to a window to speak through a lowered sheet of metal. Their voices were controlled but shaky. They spoke about their physical condition, confirmed their identities, and pleaded indirectly for calm. The administration noted their injuries but remained cautious. They still didn't understand the internal dynamics of the riot. They still believed one group was orchestrating everything. Inside L Block, the prisoners were preparing for the next phase. The Muslims created a basic organizational system: food distribution, sanitation, rotation of guard shifts. They attempted to prevent aimless violence, but their influence had limits. Some prisoners had no interest in rules. Others believed chaos was their only way to gain power. The Aryan Brotherhood held secret meetings in dark cells, plotting to challenge the Muslims if negotiations didn't go their way. Their distrust ran deep. They saw the Muslim leadership as too focused on ideology and not aggressive enough. The Brotherhood believed the administration should feel pressure through violence, not dialogue. They considered executing a hostage to force concessions. Meanwhile, unaffiliated inmates formed small alliances. Some aligned with the Muslims for protection. Others drifted toward the Brotherhood for strength. A few stayed completely independent, acting as scouts, messengers, or opportunists. Their loyalties shifted constantly, adding another layer of unpredictability. By midweek, psychological strain began wearing on everyone. The temperature inside the block rose. Water access became inconsistent. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every sound echoed through the concrete walls. Shouting, metal scraping, coughing, whispered arguments, the constant thud of people moving through darkness. The hostages were dehydrated, exhausted, and terrified. Some inmates began hallucinating from lack of rest. Others grew violent for no reason. Chaos wasn't just around them, it was inside their minds. The turning point came when an inmate accused of being an informant attempted to flee toward the hostage area, believing guards would protect him. His escape triggered a violent confrontation. Several inmates cornered him. The struggle was loud, chaotic, and unavoidable. The hostages heard everything. After minutes of shouting, the block went silent. The inmate was dead. His body was dragged into a corner cell and covered. That killing, though not the first, shifted the atmosphere sharply. The riot had crossed into a stage where everyone understood that death was no longer an exception. It was becoming part of the routine. The administration suspected as much, but had no confirmation. They pushed for more communication. The inmates responded with controlled statements, hiding the full extent of the violence to maintain leverage. Days passed, and cracks inside the leadership widened. The Muslims were losing control of the Brotherhood. Smaller groups refused to follow orders. Even some of the Muslim members were becoming frustrated with the slow pace of negotiation. The alliance that held the riot together was held by threads that frayed more with every hour. Meanwhile, the administration developed a partial understanding of the internal divide through phone intercepts and informant messages from other cell blocks. This gave them a new strategy: delay. The longer they waited, the more likely the inmate alliance would collapse from the inside. Inside L Block, the prisoners didn't know they were being outmaneuvered. All they felt was the pressure tightening. Food supplies dropped. Water grew scarce. Tempers flared. Prisoners fought each other over blankets and flashlight batteries. Leaders shouted to maintain order, but their voices were drowned out by the weight of exhaustion and paranoia. One guard hostage suffered a medical emergency: severe dehydration, dizziness, and confusion. The Muslims insisted he be brought to the window for medical attention. The Brotherhood refused, claiming it made them look weak. The disagreement escalated. It took hours of negotiation inside the block before they agreed to present the hostage to prison staff for limited treatment. The gesture helped keep outside negotiations alive, but deepened internal resentment. The Brotherhood saw it as a concession. The Muslims saw it as necessary. Independent inmates saw it as a sign that leadership was divided. By the end of the week, the block was on edge. Every inmate understood the truth. The riot wasn't going to last forever. When it ended, there would be consequences. And those consequences made desperation grow. Some inmates wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to fight to the death. Some wanted to escape. Others wanted revenge. The power struggle had reached its peak. And the next move, whether from inside or outside, would determine who would live, who would die, and how the riot would be remembered. By the 8th day, the negotiation process was barely functioning. What started as controlled communication had deteriorated into a slow, unsteady back and forth that produced nothing meaningful. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides were distrustful. And both sides were preparing for an end that would not be peaceful. The administration, working from a series of makeshift command posts, had shifted its strategy entirely. Early attempts to resolve the riot through compromise were replaced with long delays, vague promises, and careful wording. They knew the inmate alliance inside L Block was fracturing. They could see the signs in every message: inconsistent demands, changes in tone, and disagreements obvious even through muffled shouting. The prison's leadership made a calculated decision: stall, wait, and let the inmates turn on one another. Inside the block, the inmates felt the shift even if they couldn't identify its source. Negotiations no longer brought progress. Instead, they brought confusion and rising anger. Messages from the administration felt rehearsed and empty. Requests for water, medical supplies, and safety guarantees were met with delays or partial responses. The Muslims accused the administration of bad faith. The Aryan Brotherhood accused the Muslims of being too soft. Independent inmates accused everyone of lying. The atmosphere was suffocating. Trash piled up in corners. Water rationing became desperate. Some inmates began drinking from sinks connected to rusted pipes. Others fought over scraps of leftover food. The smell of sweat, smoke, and unwashed bodies filled every hallway. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted constantly by shouts, arguments, or weapons clashing against metal. The hostages suffered the most. Their physical condition worsened. Dehydration, bruising, dizziness, and infection spread. Some tried to stay quiet, hoping not to draw attention. Others couldn't hide their fear anymore. When guards broke down crying, inmates yelled at them to stay quiet. The emotional collapse of the hostages made even some inmates uneasy, not out of sympathy, but because instability made the situation more unpredictable. The turning point came when the administration demanded a full head count of hostages and a guarantee of their safety. The Muslim leaders agreed. They needed negotiations to continue. They needed time. They needed to prove they still held organized control. But the Aryan Brotherhood refused. They believed giving the administration a detailed list would reveal weakness. They believed pressure should escalate, not soften. The disagreement exploded into a full argument. Voices carried through the entire block. Hostages overheard every word. At one point, Brotherhood members threatened to take a hostage to send a message. The Muslims blocked the attempt, sparking a physical fight that nearly killed 2 inmates. Makeshift weapons clashed in the hallway. Other prisoners rushed in, trying to separate the groups. For several minutes, the riot almost turned into a full civil war. The guard hostages watched in horror, realizing their survival depended not on negotiation, but on whether the factions inside could stop themselves from killing one another. When the fight broke apart, the block was quieter, but more dangerous. The alliance was broken. What held the riot together now was not unity, but necessity. No one wanted to lose control before the administration made a clear move. No one wanted to appear weak. But every group now planned independently, preparing for outcomes that didn't involve cooperation. The administration sensed the weakness instantly. Instead of addressing any demands, they sent vague promises. We're reviewing your requests. We're discussing policy changes. We're considering independent mediation. None of it meant anything. It was designed to keep inmates divided and fighting among themselves. Inside, frustration turned to rage. A younger inmate, part of neither major group, accused the leadership of failing. He shouted in the middle of the block that they were all going to die in there. Tensions flared. 2 inmates beat him until he fell unconscious. His body lay on the floor for hours before anyone moved it. His collapse reinforced what everyone already knew. Disorder had taken over. Communication with the administration grew more chaotic. Sometimes the inmates responded. Sometimes they ignored messages entirely. Sometimes different groups answered at the same time, shouting conflicting demands. The administration documented everything. The more disorganized the inmates appeared, the stronger the state's position became. By the 9th night, the block felt broken. The Muslims held their ground near the hostages. The Brotherhood controlled the far side. Independent inmates drifted like ghosts from cell to cell. The smell of smoke lingered from small fire set earlier in the day. Flickering lights cast long shadows across the concrete. Every noise felt like a threat. Every conversation carried an edge of desperation. Inside the block, people looked older than they did a week before. Hollow eyes, shaking hands, cracked lips. Exhaustion had become a form of torture. The hostages reached a breaking point. One guard collapsed from severe dehydration, and the Muslims insisted he be brought to the window again. The Brotherhood resisted, but eventually gave in. The guard was escorted to the window, and placed in view of officials. His voice was barely audible. He begged for water. He begged them not to storm the block. His condition shook even the hardened negotiators outside. But the administration's strategy didn't change. They continued delaying. They continued demanding proof. They continued waiting for the inmates to destroy themselves. Inside, resentment toward the administration grew. Some inmates claimed the prison wanted them dead. Others believed negotiations were a trap. Others thought a tactical assault was imminent. Fear spiraled into aggression. Arguments escalated into fights. Fights escalated into stabbings. The Muslims attempted to maintain order, but were losing influence with every passing hour. Resources were nearly gone. Food was limited to scraps. Water was dangerously low. The block had become a pressure chamber with no air left. Inmates who once expected to negotiate a peaceful resolution now saw only two possible outcomes: surrender or death. Near midnight, a final blow hit morale inside L Block. The administration announced through the barricades that they would only negotiate if all hostages were brought to a single location and visible at once. It was an impossible demand. The Brotherhood refused immediately. Smaller groups agreed. The Muslims tried to mediate. The argument became a shouting match that echoed through the block for hours. Negotiations didn't just stall, they collapsed entirely. When dawn approached, the inmates realized something unmistakable. The administration wasn't coming to save them. They weren't coming to compromise. They weren't coming to negotiate a peaceful end. They were waiting for the prisoners to break, waiting for violence to force a resolution, waiting for a moment when intervention would look justified. Inside L Block, everyone could feel it. The end was close. But how it would come, and how many would die before it did, was still unknown. By the 10th day, the Lucasville riot had reached its peak. The block reeked of smoke, sweat, and fear. Injuries from stabbings and fights had mounted, and exhaustion weighed on everyone inside. The hostages had endured nearly 2 weeks of captivity, dehydration, and psychological torment. Outside, the administration and state officials were preparing for a storm that they hoped would break the inmate alliance without a full-blown assault. But the decision came too late for simple solutions. Inside L Block, factions were fraying completely. The Aryan Brotherhood openly defied Muslim leaders, asserting control over certain cell clusters. Independent inmates watched silently, waiting for opportunities to shift alliances or exploit chaos. Weapons were everywhere: sharpened metal, broom handles, broken furniture, and improvised clubs. The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew that one wrong move could ignite mass violence. Negotiations had all but collapsed. Any attempt at dialogue was met with contradictory responses. The inmates had realized that the administration's strategy was clear: stall, observe, and wait for them to destroy themselves. Trust evaporated. Each group now prepared for survival over strategy. Hostages, meanwhile, were in dire condition. Some could barely stand. Many were bruised and bleeding. The psychological trauma had etched itself into every expression, every tremor, every silent prayer. The final violent escalation came when the Aryan Brotherhood decided to assert dominance once and for all. They attacked independent inmates they suspected of aligning with the Muslims. A brawl erupted in the central corridor. Fists, clubs, and knives clashed. Blood pooled across the floor. Hostages screamed, barricades shook, and the temporary order inside the block disintegrated completely. Even the Muslim leaders, who had tried to mediate, were drawn into the chaos. By this point, leadership had become a survival tactic rather than a system of control. Outside, tactical planning was at its peak. Officials considered storming the block, but feared mass casualties. Media scrutiny was increasing. Helicopter footage had leaked, showing smoke and movement. Families were desperate for news. Every decision was a calculation of risk versus control. The administration decided to wait until a clear opportunity presented itself, a moment when a single strike could minimize deaths and regain control. Eventually, the moment came. A group of inmates, exhausted and disoriented, left a barricade partially unguarded. Tactical teams moved quickly. Using gas and stun devices, they stormed the block. Chaos erupted, screams echoed, and hostages were freed. By the time the smoke cleared, several inmates and 2 hostages were dead. Many more were wounded. The surviving inmates were restrained, handcuffed, and removed from the block under tight security. In the days following the riot, the official narrative began to take shape, but it was incomplete. State reports emphasized that the riot was contained and that negotiations had prevented further loss of life. Detailed accounts of internal fights, the collapse of inmate alliances, and the terror endured by hostages were minimized. The most violent moments, including killings within L Block, were barely mentioned. Survivors of the riot reported being warned not to speak publicly. Internal memos were classified, and many details were buried under layers of bureaucratic control. Families of the hostages and some journalists began piecing together the real story. Interviews, informal reports, and archived notes revealed the extent of the chaos inside L Block. The fractured inmate leadership, the failed negotiations, the stabbings, and the desperation that drove prisoners to extremes. These accounts contradicted the polished official reports, showing that the riot had been far more lethal, more organized, and more terrifying than publicly admitted. The aftermath left long scars. Inmates who had survived were transferred to other maximum security facilities, some under stricter confinement. Hostages required extensive psychological treatment. Guards were traumatized, with some developing post-traumatic stress and ongoing anxiety. The prison itself underwent minor renovations, but no systemic reforms addressed the deep-rooted causes: overcrowding, racial tension, religious disputes, and administrative neglect. Over the years, the Lucasville riot became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of institutional failure. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports later highlighted the triggers: the TB testing dispute, racial tensions, and the years of neglect that primed the prison for eruption. Yet, the administration's attempts to bury the most violent details created a gap in public understanding. Many of the prisoners who played central roles in the riot have remained obscure, their identities blurred in media reports, while the larger narrative focused on a simplified account of chaos and negotiation. The riot also exposed the dangers of ignoring warning signs. In the weeks leading up to the uprising, multiple reports from staff and inmates had indicated tension and potential violence. Warnings went unheeded, policies were enforced without consideration for religious or cultural concerns, and understaffed units allowed friction to escalate unchecked. The tragedy at Lucasville demonstrated how a single confrontation, left unaddressed, could ignite a cascade of violence capable of overwhelming even the most rigid systems. Today, Lucasville is remembered not only for its chaos, but for the lessons it provides. Overcrowded prisons, neglected inmate grievances, and fragile leadership structures create environments where violence is inevitable. The riot, and the attempt to obscure its full severity, remain a stark warning of what can happen when a system prioritizes control and appearances over safety, communication, and accountability. The events of April 1993 left an indelible mark on U.S. prison history. Lucasville is no longer just a location. It is a symbol of institutional collapse, human desperation, and the consequences of neglecting the most basic principles of management and justice. The truth of what happened inside L Block, hostage terror, factional infighting, and unchecked brutality, remains a story that some tried to erase. But for those who survived, for the families of hostages, and for those who study prison dynamics, it is a story that cannot be forgotten. The riot was more than a violent eruption. It was a mirror reflecting the consequences of systemic failure. And though the administration attempted to sanitize its memory, the raw, horrifying truth of Lucasville persists, etched into the walls, the accounts of survivors, and the history of U.S. corrections.